Okay, let's see. Let me just change the. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala ashraf al-anbiya wal mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So this is lesson 13 in our lessons on the Mukhtasar of Imam al-Quduri. And in this lesson, we're going to be looking at some of the rulings related to recitation, some of which we have taken before, and also the witr prayer. And if time permits, we'll also get into some of the ahkam related to the congregational prayer, even though I think that we'll most probably leave that to the next lesson. And so again, we'll dive straight into the text, beginning with Imam al-Quduri section on recitation. So Imam al-Quduri begins by saying وَيَجْحَرُ بِالْقِرَاءَةِ فِي الْفَجْرِ وَرَكْعَتَيْنِ الْأُولَيَيْنِ مِنَ الْمَغْرِبِ وَالْإِشَاءِ إِنْ كَانَ إِمَامًا. That if one is the Imam, he recites out loud in Fajr and the first two cycles of Maghrib and Isha. ويخفي الإمام القراءة فيما بعد الأوليين. And the Imam recites silently in the last two cycles. And of course, this is something that is rather familiar to all of us as a practice in our congregational prayers. And for the Imam in specific, to recite out loud in these prayers and to recite silently in these prayers is considered something that is wajib, or something that is considered necessary. And the reason for this is because this is something that was the inherited practice of virtually all Muslims from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. There are some reports that the Prophet initially would recite all the prayers, I believe, out loud, but then because of specific reasons, Dhuhr and Asr were he began to perform silently. But regardless, this became the practice of the entire Muslim Ummah. So it's almost an ijma'i type of rule. And so this is what the Hanafis deem to be wajib on the Imam for the various prayers in terms of reciting out loud or reciting silently. Now, there are a few topic governing principles over here that we should be aware of. I've listed 4 over here. The first principle is that every dhikr that is obligatory in prayer, that means it is a rukn in prayer, it is permitted for loud recitation to be associated with it. It is permitted for loud recitation to be associated with it. And one of the things that the ulama mention is that the basis when it comes to the arkan of salah is idhar. The basis when it comes to the arkan of salah is that the arkan of salah need to be almost publicly demonstrated, publicly expressed. And so when we look at all the arkan of the prayer, when we look at things like the ruku', the sujood, the qiyam, these are all public actions. They're visible to people. there is an idhar of the prayer through these actions. And so similarly, qira'ah, the asr when it comes to it, as one of the arkan of salah, is that there should be a form of idhar. And so this is why many of the prayers have this element of loud recitation associated with them when it comes to a congregational setting. But then there were others where the Prophet ﷺ, for various reasons, chose to recite silently, as we mentioned. But it is permitted generally for dhikr, that is obligatory in prayer, for loud recitation to be associated with it, because of this idea that the basis when it comes to arkan is that they be publicly manifest and expressed. Another topic governing principle in this section is every prayer for which congregation is a condition, the sunnah of recitation is to recite out loud. Okay, and by the sunnah of recitation over here, they really mean that it is considered almost wajib. And an example of this, for example, will be Jum'ah. Okay, an example of this is Jum'ah. For Jum'ah, the jama'ah, the congregation, is a condition for the validity of Jum'ah, right? For Eid, the jama'ah is considered a condition for the validity of the Eid prayer, and so that is why the sunnah of recitation, namely the obligation of or the wajib of recitation over here, is to recite out loud. Then we have a third topic governing principle, that it is wajib for the imam to maintain loud recitation in prayers where recitation is usually performed out loud. And so this would be the Fajr, the Maghrib, and the Isha prayer, and in the first two rak'ahs specifically of the Maghrib and Isha prayer. Whereas Fajr only has two rak'ahs, so it is all the cycles of the Fajr prayer. And then we have a final topic governing principle. It is recommended for the one praying alone to perform in the manner that he would have, to perform the prayer in a manner that it would have been performed in the congregation. And we've taken rulings related to this in the past, and we'll remind you of those in a few slides. So when Imam al-Quduri mentions that the Imam recites out loud in Fajr and the first two cycles of Maghrib and Isha, right? And he recites silently in the last two cycles. Why does he recite silently in the last two cycles? Because it returns to this topic governing principle that we mentioned, right? That every dhikr that is obligatory in prayer, it is permitted for loud recitation to be associated with it. The last two cycles, there is no obligatory qira'ah in these two cycles, right? We mentioned previously that the obligatory recitation is specified to the first two cycles, right? And the wajib recitation of the Fatiha and the Surah is specified to the first two cycles. And so the basis is that the last two cycles, there is no obligatory or wajib recitation associated with it. And this is why the Imam, when he prays, the last two cycles, there is no performing of the qira'ah out loud. So it returns to this topic governing principle. So the basis is that it is not permitted for loud recitation to be associated with these final two cycles, because they are not places in the prayer where an obligatory recitation or a wajib recitation is performed. So that should be clear to everyone. Then we have this legal ruling that Imam al-Quduri mentions. He says, وَإِنْ كَانَ مُنْفَرِدًا فَهُوَ مُخَيَّرٌ إِنْ شَاءَ جَهَرَ وَأَسْمَعَ نَفْسَهُ وَإِنْ شَاءَ خَافَتْ. For one who is praying alone, he has a choice. Either he may recite out loud, such that he can hear himself, or he may recite silently. Right? He can recite out loud, or he can recite silently. And the Hanafi ulama said that, well, over here, basically, this is kind of similar to the idea that we took when it came to the khilaf on whether the person praying alone does tasmi' and tahmid. Does the person praying alone, does he say both Sami Allahu liman hamida, Rabbana lakal hamd, or does he simply say Rabbana lakal hamd, or does he only say Sami Allahu liman hamida? We took that there were various, the ulama had various ideas in their mind of what the munfarid, what the person praying alone, what he represented, and what he was doing with his zikr and his recitation. And so, some of the ulama in this specific case, in the case of recitation, said that, well, this individual is an imam fi haqqi nafsihi. In relation to himself, this individual is considered an imam, and so he can recite out loud if he wishes, but he may also recite silently because there is really no one following him. There's no one following him, and the purpose of recitation out loud is mainly because so the followers can listen and reflect, and contemplate on the Quran, and so on and so forth. And so this meaning is not fulfilled in the person who's praying alone, and so he may recite silently. And so because we have both the aspect of being an imam in relation to himself, and the fact that his reciting out loud has no actual function or benefit in terms of because he lacks a congregation, so the ulama said, gave him a choice that you can do either recitation out loud, or you can do recitation silently. And again, this same idea can be seen in a way impacting also the legal rulings on whether the person praying alone says Sami Allahu liman hamida. Is the person praying alone considered an imam in relation to himself, such that he should say Sami Allahu liman hamida as well as Rabbana lakal hamd, or does that serve no function because he does not have a congregation, and Sami Allahu liman hamida is basically telling people to engage in hamd, and there's no one around him, so he should simply suffice with Rabbana lakal hamd. That same meaning is being manifest over here, and guiding these specific legal rulings. So over here they gave him a choice of either reciting out loud or reciting silently. But the ulama do mention that it is better for this individual who is praying alone to recite out loud in the Fajr, Maghrib, and Isha prayers, specifically. And the reason for this is because it connects back to that topic governing principle that we mentioned, that it is recommended for the one praying alone to perform prayer in the manner it would have been performed in congregation. Right? And so if you remember the discussion that we had on, does the person who missed prayer, an individual who is missing prayer, does he perform the adhan and the iqamah? And we mentioned this idea that the Hanafi scholars of Usul al-Fiqh mention, that we have an ada kamil, and then we have an ada naqis. We have a current performance of the prayer that is either deemed, it is complete and perfect, and then one that is deemed deficient, right? So praying in congregation is deemed ada kamil. Praying alone is deemed an ada naqis. You've performed the prayer, but there's some deficiency in it, because the optimal form to pray a current performance is in a congregational setting. And so the ulama generally recommended that when you're praying a qada, then it is best to perform it in the manner you would have performed a normal ada. It is best to perform it in the manner you would have performed a normal ada. And so similarly, the notion over here is that because the congregational prayer is the most complete and perfected form of the ada, if someone misses the congregational prayer, it is still recommended for him to perform prayer in a way that he would have in congregation, because this is the most akmal form of the performance of a current prayer. And so if the congregational prayer involved recitation out loud, then it is optimal for the person praying alone to perform that prayer with recitation out loud. But if you notice, Imam al-Quduri says that he should perform this jahar, this recitation out loud, in a way asma'a nafsahu, that he hears himself. And so the idea that Imam al-Quduri is trying to get across over here is that, I guess there's two things. First of all, the minimal definition of recitation that we took, which is that one should be able to move his tongue and create some audible sound that he is able to hear. That's one. But the second is also, normally in a prayer that is a loud prayer, you're not simply reciting at a volume where you can hear yourself. You're reciting at a volume where people who are around you can hear as well. And so over here, Imam al-Quduri is hinting at the idea that you should not perform in this context when you're praying alone. If you decide to perform your recitation out loud, you should not do it too loudly, because its function of informing people that no longer exists. And so you don't really need to be so loud such that people around you would hear your recitation. Rather, it is sufficient over here to simply pronounce the words in a way where it is clear to oneself, but not excessively loud, or not loud in a way you would have been when leading an actual congregation. Then Imam al-Quduri continues and he says, ويخفي الإمام القراءة في الظهر والعصر. The Imam recites silently in Dhuhr and Asr. And again, this is wajib, because this is the inherited practice of the Muslims from the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And again, there's no khilaf, it seems, on this point amongst mainstream Sunni scholarship. And again, this sort of can tie into the idea, the epistemological foundation that we took of a theory of the early community. And so this was the practice of the early community. This was the practice of the fuqaha of the early community. And so the Hanafis deemed it to be necessary, because it was so widespread and it was so established that there was really no doubt regarding this being a practice that went back to the time of the Prophet ﷺ himself. So that basically concludes this section on recitation. There are actually going to be other ahkam related to recitation that will come up, but what Imam al-Quduri does now is he goes into some of the rulings related to the witr prayer. And so the witr prayer is a really interesting prayer. There's a lot of khilaf on it. There's a lot of legal concepts that appear and guide Hanafi juristic understandings of the witr prayer. And so we'll be taking some of the sections in this, some of the rulings in this particular section in a little bit more detail than the discussion we just had. And of course, this is a point of, there's a lot of difference of opinion between the madhab on this, with the Hanafis having one approach to witr and the Shafi'is having another and the Malikis having another. And so it makes for interesting discussion in that regard as well. And so again, we'll dive straight into the book. Imam al-Quduri, he begins by saying, وَالْوِتْرُ ثَلَاثُ رَكَعَاتٍ لَا يَفْصِلُ بَيْنَهُنَّ بِسَلَامٍ. That witr is 3 cycles and one is not to separate them with a salam. And so over here, basically, we have two main discussions when it comes to the witr prayer. The first is the ruling of witr. You know, is the witr a sunnah? Is it a wajib? Is it a fard? Is it just a mustahab? You know, what exactly is the ruling of the witr prayer? The second is the description of the witr prayer. How is it to be performed? Is it performed with one salam? Is it one rak'ah? Is it three rak'ahs? Is it five rak'ahs? Is it seven rak'ahs? How many? What's the exact manner in which the witr prayer is to be performed by an individual? And so these are the two discussions that we'll be looking at in this section. So the ruling of witr, again, as usual with many other things, we have some khilaf between the Hanafi ulama on this point. And so Abu Hanifa basically says that, well, there are three opinions related from Abu Hanifa on the ruling of witr. The first position is that it is fard. It is an obligatory prayer, like the other obligatory prayers. And this was related from him by Hamad bin Zayd. And this is not the relied upon position in the school. This is not the relied upon position in the school. Then another opinion is that it is a sunnah. So Abu Hanifa deemed it a sunnah according to one riwayah. And this is basically the same thing that Abu Yusuf and Muhammad mentioned. This is the same opinion that Abu Yusuf and Muhammad held, which was that it is a sunnah, and specifically a very emphasized sunnah that was more emphatic in its sunniyah and in its recommendation than all the other sunan prayers. Then we have a third opinion from Abu Hanifa, which was related, I believe, by his student Yusuf bin Khalid, who was a famous Basran, that it is wajib or necessary. And this is the relied upon view in the school, and this is the view that has been selected by virtually all the ulama of the Hanafi school, namely that witr is wajib according to Abu Hanifa. And so over here we have discussions on why did these ulama differ, and what was the reasoning behind their specific positions. And so, of course, we're not going to deal with the position, the reasoning underlying the riwayat that state that Abu Hanifa deemed it obligatory, because this is really not a strong position at all in the school. And so we'll stick to simply the relied upon position of the school in the explanation that I'll be giving. So let's begin with the reasoning of Abu Yusuf and Muhammad. Right? The reasoning of Abu Yusuf and Muhammad. According to Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, witr cannot be deemed necessary or an obligation. Why? Because we know those prayers that we are obliged to perform. The nusus are very clear on the prayers that we are obliged to perform. And there are hadith after hadith after hadith from the Prophet ﷺ that affirm that there are only 5 obligatory prayers. There are only 5 prayers that an individual has to perform that are of an obligatory / necessary nature. And so in this hadith from Bukhari, for example, when the Prophet ﷺ sent Sayyidina Mu'adh radiallahu anhu, when he sent him to Yemen, he told him, what did he instruct Mu'adh? فَعَلِّمْهُمْ أَنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ افْتَرَضَ عَلَيْهِمْ 5 صَلَوَاتٍ فِي كُلِّ يَوْمٍ وَلَيْلَةٍ. That teach the people who you are going to, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has obligated upon them 5 prayers during the day and the night. And witr is not amongst these 5 prayers. And so if witr was wajib, if it was something that had to be performed, then the Prophet ﷺ would have informed his Mu'adh about this, and he would have told Mu'adh, inform your people that they have to perform witr. And so according to Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, they are using this usul again, that there are certain things that are established clearly within the nusus. There are specific things that are established decisively within the nusus, and the existence of 5 obligatory prayers is one such thing. And so we cannot condition these instructions from the Prophet ﷺ, we cannot condition this well-known and decisive obligation of there being only 5 prayers that are fard, that are required of us in the daily prayers that we perform. We cannot condition this with these other hadith that are on a lower epistemological level, namely the hadith on witr. And so what we're going to say is the witr is a sunnah. We're not going to put it in a category where it becomes binding on an individual to perform. So this is the reasoning of Abu Yusuf Muhammad from a textual perspective. They also had other reasons. And so one of the things is the sunnah prayers actually have very distinctive signs to them. There are specific elements of the sunnah that are not to be found, that are not shared with the obligatory prayers. And there are specific things within the obligatory prayers that allow them to stand out from the sunnah prayers. And so Abu Yusuf Muhammad, they also argued that the signs of being a sunnah are evident in the witr prayer. In what way? Well, witr does not have an independent time of its own. The basis is that a fard prayer, any prayer that is an obligation on an individual, that one is required to perform, has its own independent time. But witr does not have its own independent time. Like other sunan, it basically follows the Isha prayer. The witr prayer has no dedicated adhan or iqamah, whereas the fard prayer does. The witr prayer has no congregation associated with it, which the prayers that we are obligated to do every day, they do have congregations associated with them. In witr, the recitation is required in every cycle, according to the Hanafis. And the idea of recitation in every cycle is something specific to the sunnah or nawafil prayers. It is only the sunnah and nawafil prayers that recitation is required in all cycles. In the fard prayer, yes, we do recite in the last 2 cycles, or the final cycle of a 3-cycle prayer, but those last 2 cycles of the fard in a 4 rak'ah fard prayer, or the final cycle in a 3 rak'ah fard prayer, it is not actually obligatory or required to recite in those cycles. And so these are all, the witr in many ways resembles the sunnah prayer. And so this, coupled with the fact that we know that there are only 5 obligatory prayers, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not legislated anything above and beyond those 5 prayers in terms of what we need to pray in our everyday lives, then we will deem the witr to be a sunnah and not to be something connected to the fard in any way. So this was the reasoning of Abu Yusuf and Muhammad. What was the reasoning of Abu Hanifa? Right? What was the reasoning of Abu Hanifa? So the reasoning of Abu Hanifa looked at various hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, and he saw a degree of emphasis in these hadith that are not found for other normal sunnah prayers. And so in Abu Dawood, it is related from the Prophet ﷺ that he said, "Al-witru haqqun, faman lam yutira falaysa minna." Right? And he said this 3 times, that the witr is a haqq, and whoever does not perform it is not from us. So this is a very emphatic hadith. The Prophet ﷺ saying the witr is a haqq, and if you do not perform it, then you are not from us. You have done something that has made you essentially distinguished from this community of the Prophet ﷺ. Abu Hanifa said this is a very big deal. This is a very emphatic statement on the part of the Prophet ﷺ. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, one day he came out to his companions and he gave them some glad tidings. And what did he say? He said, لَقَدْ أَمَدَّكُمْ بِصَلَاةٍ هِيَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you an extra prayer in the night, which is better for you than red camels. And red camels were very sort of high-bred camels and very valuable with the Arabs at the time. And then the Prophet said, هِيَ الْوِتْرُ فِيمَا بَيْنَ صَلَاةِ الْعِشَاءِ إِلَى طُلُوعِ الْفَجْرِ, that it is witr, which is performed between Isha and the rising of the dawn. And this is related by Abu Dawood and Tirmidhi. And again, over here, the Prophet, we'll get to the wording of this hadith in a second, but the Prophet ﷺ is mentioning how witr is being specifically legislated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and increased on top of the normal prayers for the Muslims, and something that they should perform within a specific time. Then another hadith from the Muslim of Imam Ahmad, where the Prophet ﷺ, where Amr ibn al-As is basically giving a khutbah on Jum'ah, and Amr says that that there was a companion that reported to me from the Prophet ﷺ that Inna Allah zadakum, right? Inna Allah zadakum salah wa hiya al-witru fasalluha fima bayna salat al-isha'i ila salat al-fajr, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you an extra prayer, or has increased upon your normal prayers an extra prayer, and it is the witr. So perform it between Isha and Fajr. So perform that prayer between Isha and the Fajr prayer. And so Abu Hanifa, what did he do? He looked at these hadith and he said, what do we see in these specific hadith? One, witr is described as a duty upon believers. Al-witru haqqun. Witr is described as a ziyada. In this hadith of Amr ibn al-As, Inna Allah zadakum. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has provided you with this extra. He's increased upon the already existing load that you have, or the already existing blessing of the obligatory prayers that you have, another prayer, which is the witr prayer. And something that the ulama mentioned in terms of a logical argument is that when we speak about ziyada, when we speak about an increase can only be something viewed in the context of an obligatory prayer, because it is the obligatory prayers that are restricted in amount. The nawafil and the sunan are not restricted in any amount. You can perform any number of nawafil that you want. And so when the Prophet said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you an extra prayer, has increased on top of the prayers that you have an extra prayer, this should mean, we should understand this as He has given you an extra prayer on top of the fard prayer, right? In addition to the normal obligatory prayers that you have. And so we should associate witr as a prayer that is being increased upon us in addition to the 5 daily prayers that we already have, right? We should not simply see it as just another nafil or sunnah prayer, because the nafil or sunnah prayer, they're not of a specific number. You can already pray as many as you want. It doesn't make sense for someone to increase on something that is already unrestricted in its number. A third argument that Abu Hanifa mentions is that there is a command to perform it in these hadith, right? So in this hadith of Amr, it said, فَصَلُّوهَا فِي مَا بَيْنَ صَلَاةِ الْعِشَاءِ إِلَى صَلَاةِ الْفَجْرِ, that perform it between the Isha and the Fajr. And the final point, and the command, as we know, we've taken this before, the asal of a command is that it entails obligation. It entails that you need to do something. Of course, the commands can be understood as recommendations or sunnahs, depending on the existence of other factors and other indicants that demonstrate the command is not intended to be for obligation. But over here, Abu Hanifa said that we'll go by the basis, which is a command entails some level of obligation. Then we have the statement of the Prophet that whoever does not perform the witr is not from us. which is a very, like I said, it's a very severe remark from the Prophet ﷺ. And it shows us that the witr is not considered simply a normal sunnah prayer, because of the emphasis that the Prophet ﷺ expressed in regards to its performance and its non-performance. And of course, there were also several companions and followers who emphasized the witr in this manner as well. And if you open a book like the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba, or the Musannaf of Abdul Razzaq, and other texts, you will find a list of those who held the witr to be obligatory from the companions and followers, and those who seemingly held the opposite position. Now over here, Abu Hanifa also uses a similar line of reasoning that the Sahibain used. So the Sahibain, what did the Sahibain say? The Sahibain said that the witr it manifests the qualities of a sunnah prayer in various ways, right? And Abu Hanifa said, well, it also manifests the qualities of an obligatory prayer, right? It departs from a normal sunnah in many ways as well. And so the ruling that it needs to be made up. If you miss a witr prayer, you need to perform qada of it. This is actually even true with Abu Yusuf and Muhammad. Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, while deeming the witr to be a sunnah, still consider it necessary to make it up if you miss that witr. So it has a uniqueness in that sense. Which other sunnah has this element of makeup associated with it? The basis is that a makeup is associated with the obligatory. And so this is something that Abu Yusuf and Muhammad also hold. And so Abu Hanifa says, well, you guys are also saying that this prayer needs to be made up. So in this context, it is resembling an obligatory prayer. Then we have the ruling that it cannot be prayed on a riding animal, right? And you can replace riding animal with, it cannot be prayed in a car or whatever. So the basis when it comes to the nawafil prayer is, the nawafil prayer can be prayed. You don't actually have to be standing or sitting on the ground, right? You can pray in a moving vehicle simply with head movements, right? Without necessarily having to be in the direction of the qibla. The nawafil prayer, there are a number of arkan and shurut that drop for the nawafil prayer, because the nawafil prayer, there's a component of facilitation when it comes to what is permitted in the nawafil prayer, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it more expansive in terms of how it can be performed and where it can be performed and so on and so forth, which is of course not the case with the obligatory prayers. And so one of the things that are permitted with the nawafil prayer, and this is established of course explicitly in the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, is that the nawafil prayer can be performed in a moving vehicle with head movements. This ruling does not apply to witr. For witr, you need to pray as you would perform a normal obligatory prayer, which is you have to be on the ground, you have to be facing the qibla, you have to have qiyam and an actual ruku, an actual sujood, and so on and so forth. This is also the view of Abu Yusuf and Muhammad. Again, in this specific ruling, the witr takes on the rulings in the form of an obligatory prayer. And so this is why Imam Muhammad himself in his Al-Hujjah, ala Ahl al-Madinah, he mentions that the fuqaha, they displayed a type of strictness. Al-fuqaha شددوا في الوتر ما لم يشددوا في غيرها من الصلوات سوى صلوات الخمس فقال بعضهم سنة لا ينبغي تركها وقال بعضهم واجبة. That the jurists displayed a degree of strictness in regard to the witr that they did not display in regard to any other prayer besides it, with the exception of the 5 daily prayers. And so some of the fuqaha said it is a sunnah that should not be left, whereas others said it was obligatory. Imam Muhammad uses the word wajib, but he means obligatory. And this is, I've mentioned this point before, that it's really interesting. These early ulama did not have the same mustalah, have the same terminology as later ulama. They often used This idea of sunnah la yanbaghi tarkuha, a sunnah that should not be left, is almost akin to a wajib. It's basically a wajib, according to later ulama. And so the terminology, we need to be careful of terminology when it comes to these early books, because they were often using the word wajib to mean fard. And this even continues very late. Imam al-Quduri, Imam al-Karhi, all these people are still using the word wajib to mean fard, even though we know slightly later that Hanafis begin to distinguish between fard, wajib, sunnah in a very sort of in a clearer way. And so over here, Imam Muhammad expresses this idea that the jurists displayed, they were very strict in regard to the witr and in the ahkam they associated with it, in a way that distinguished it from other normal sunnah prayers. And so this was Abu Hanifa's reasoning. And then Abu Hanifa, of course, had a series of responses as well to the position of or the arguments of Abu Yusuf and Muhammad. And before that, there's also this line of reasoning that Abu Hanifa mentions, that the witr is 3 cycles. The witr is 3 cycles, and 3 cycles as a basis is considered an aberrancy for a nafil prayer. You do not find any nafil prayer that is 3 cycles. You do not find any sunnah prayer that is 3 cycles. This is something that is only a quality of the fard prayer, which is maghrib. And so again, witr takes on this quality or this resemblance to a fard prayer, as opposed to a normal sunnah or nafil prayer. And so these were some of the reasonings that Abu Hanifa mentioned. As for the points made by Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, we'll just quickly go through some of the responses that Abu Hanifa gave or would have given according to the ulama who defended him. So firstly, this idea of deeming witr wajib as being a contravention of the decisive, Abu Hanifa says, no, I'm not calling it a fard. I'm not calling it an obligation. I'm giving it a middle category between the obligatory and between the sunnah. And that is the ruling of a wajib. And so I am not contravening the decisive in any way. If I was saying it was obligatory, like the 5 daily prayers, then yes, I would have been contravening the decisive, and I would have been conditioning the decisive and the well-known legislation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with something of a lower epistemological status. But that is not what I'm doing over here. Rather, I am assigning witr a different ruling, which is the ruling of wujub, and I'm not arguing for its fardiyah, or its obligation. Secondly, Imam Abu Hanifa argues that even if witr seems like it does not have its own time, it does actually have its own time. Because according to Abu Hanifa, we do not say the time of witr prayer is the time of Isha prayer in the sense that Isha follows witr. What we mean is this is simply a shared time between 2 prayers that a person needs to perform. Right? It just so happens that the time is the same as the Isha prayer. But this does not mean that that witr does not have its own independent time. It does. This is the independent time of witr. It just so happens that it is shared with the Isha prayer. Thirdly, Abu Hanifa says your argument that witr follows Isha, and so it resembles a sunnah, because a sunnah is a prayer that basically follows a fard prayer. It has no independence of its own. Abu Hanifa says, no, it does not follow Isha prayer. It is simply a condition to pray Isha first. And we took this issue in quite some detail in a few lessons ago. And so you can refer to that for the details of this. But Abu Hanifa says, and this condition of one obligatory prayer, of a tartib or an order between obligatory prayers, is no different to any other obligatory prayers, according to us. And so we took the example of, let's say that you miss Dhuhr one day, Asr time comes in. This is the first prayer you've ever missed. the first prayer you've ever missed, according to the Hanafi ulama, you need to pray Dhuhr first, and only then can you pray. Only then can you pray Asr. If you pray Asr first before praying Dhuhr, your Asr is considered invalid because a tartib or order needs to be maintained between the obligatory prayers, unless your missed prayers reach a specific amount. If your missed prayers reach the amount of 6 or more, then the tartib is waived from you. And there are other reasons why the tartib is waived from you as well. And so Abu Hanifa says that it is merely a condition, and this condition actually exists. This condition of maintaining an order actually exists between other obligatory prayers as well. And then finally, he says the recitation in every cycle that you mentioned, this is merely out of precaution. And we'll take some details regarding this in a second. So inshallah, if you can just give me 1 minute, I just have to grab my charger, and then inshallah I'll be back and we'll continue. Okay, so this is basically, these are the arguments of Abu Hanifa and some of his counter arguments. So everyone can reflect on these, and hopefully it makes sense. But you can see that both sides have their views. They have their basis in precedent, and of course in the Hanafi school, the relied upon position is the position of Abu Hanifa, not Abu Yusuf and Muhammad. But both have reasonable arguments underpinning their position. Then, if we go back to what Imam al-Quduri mentioned, going back a few slides now, what did he mention? Right, al-Witru 3 rak'at la yafsilu baynahunna bisalamin. Right, now we're going to take this discussion on Witr being 3 cycles. Right, the Witr prayer being 3 cycles. So we know that this is, again, a difference of opinion between the various madhahib. On this issue of 3 cycles, Abu Yusuf, Muhammad, and Abu Hanifa are in agreement. And there are a number of reports from the Prophet ﷺ, or descriptions of his prayer, that indicate that he performed Witr as 3. And so first we have this very famous report in the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari, where Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anhu is describing the tahajjud of the Prophet ﷺ, and she mentions the amount or the quantity of the Prophet's prayer, and then she mentions as his final prayer, right, ثُمَّ يُصَلِّي ثَلَاثًا, right, then he prayed 3 cycles. And this was, of course, a reference to the Witr prayer. And we know this is a reference to the Witr prayer because Sayyidah Aisha over here in this hadith, she actually asks, قالت عائشة فقلت يا رسول الله أتنام قبل أن توتر, that do you sleep before you perform the Witr, right? Do you sleep before you perform the Witr? And so the Prophet ﷺ responds that my إن عيني تنامان ولا ينام قلبي, that my 2 eyes sleep, but my heart does not sleep. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so over here, the Witr, the final prayer that the Prophet performed at the night, which was the Witr prayer, is over here 3 cycles. Then we have this report from the Sunan of Imam al-Nasa'i, and this is related by various companions of the Prophet. This version by Ubay ibn Ka'ab, he says that the Prophet ﷺ يقرأ في الوتر في ركعة الأولى بسبح اسم ربك الأعلى وفي ركعة الثانية بقل يا أيها الكافرون وفي ركعة الثالثة بقل هو الله أحد. Right, the Prophet ﷺ would recite سبح اسم ربك الأعلى in the first cycle, قل يا أيها الكافرون in the second, and قل هو الله أحد in the third. Again, this is an indication that the Prophet's witr was 3 cycles. الإمام الترمذي mentions وفي الباب عن إمران بن حسين وعائشة وابن عباس وأبي أيوب وعبد الرحمن عن Ubay ibn Ka'ab. And so various companions of the Prophet ﷺ, such as Imran ibn Hussein, Aisha ibn Abbas, Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, and others, related similarly from the Prophet ﷺ. So all these reports indicate that he prayed witr as 3 cycles. Then we have other reports as well from the companions over here from the Muwatta of Imam Muhammad, that Imam Muhammad relates from Ibn Mas'ud with his chain that al-witru thalathu كثلاث المغرب. Sorry, al-witru thalathun كثلاث المغرب. That the witr is 3 cycles, like the 3 cycles of Maghrib. And then in his Kitab al-Athar, again, Imam Muhammad relates from Abu Hanifa, from Hamad, from Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, that Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, he said, I would not like to leave the 3 cycles of witr, even if it were for red camels, right? Even if I were given red camels. And what did Muhammad say? وَبِهِ نَأْخُذْ. That this is the opinion that we go by. So again, over here you have the practice of Ibn Mas'ud, you have the practice of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, and you have the practice of other fuqaha from the Salaf regarding this. And if you look at the Muwatta of Imam Muhammad, and the Muwatta of Imam Muhammad has been translated into English, he brings a whole series of hadith in the chapter on witr regarding why the Hanafis state that it is 3 cycles, and why they state that salam is only given at the end of the witr prayer. لا يفصل بينهن بسلام, as Imam al-Quduri mentions. And so one can look at that. You know, he mentioned a series of hadith in this regard in various books of his. One of the reasons why I quote, I mean, these are not oftentimes, you know, people, we like to quote Bukhari, Nasa'i, Tirmidhi, etc. I like to look at the Kitab al-Athar of Imam Muhammad, the al-Hujjah ala Ahl al-Madinah of Imam Muhammad, the Muwatta, and other such books, because these give us insight into, okay, what were the evidences that the Imams were actually using. Of course, as tradition grows, we expand on their arguments, and we buttress their arguments. We add our own istidlal, we add our own hadith and stuff. And of course, this is how traditions operate, and there's no issue with that. But it's also very interesting for a student of knowledge, especially someone who's interested in going into a more advanced level of fiqh studies, to go back to some of these books, some of these primary works of the madhab, and see that, okay, what was the specific hadith that these imams were using? What was Imam Muhammad, what hadith was he using, and what was his legal reasoning? Because it gives you a fairer insight into what their arguments actually were. And no one has a problem with someone expanding or making other arguments on their behalf, but it's always a good exercise to know what a jurist was himself saying, because it gives you insight into his own thought process and his own, juristic approach to these issues. And so even the hadith that I actually mentioned from Bukhari and Nasa'i and others, a lot of these hadith are hadith that Imam Muhammad either indicates an awareness of, or he uses in his own books like Kitab al-Athar, or in his riwayah of Muwatta, and so on and so forth. And so it's always good to consult some of these primary texts in order to get an understanding of what the Imams were actually using in terms of hadith proof and fiqh argumentation and so forth. So we have a number of reports from the Prophet. We have reports from Ibn Mas'ud, from Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhum. And then we have this idea that, the Hanafis also said that there were many comparisons between the witr and the maghrib prayer. Right? We've seen one from Abdullah bin Mas'ud, which was quite explicit, which is that, al-witru thalathun ka thalath al-maghrib. That witr is 3 cycles, like 3 cycles of maghrib. The Hanafi said there are other hadith that also seem to make a connection between the witr of the night and the maghrib prayer. And so this again is related by Imam Muhammad in the Muwatta, in his riwayah of the Muwatta of Imam Malik. And so he says that Malik informed us from Abdullah ibn Dinar and Ibn Umar that Ibn Umar said, Salatul Maghrib, what is it? Salatul Maghrib, witru Salatul Nahar. That the Maghrib is the witr of basically the prayers of the day. Okay, so daytime is ending. Salatul Maghrib is like the witr of it. You perform it when the day is ended. And so Imam Muhammad in the Muwatta, what Imam Muhammad says is وبهذا نأخذ وينبغي لمن جعل المغرب, right, وتر صلاة النهار كما قال ابن عمر أن يكون وتر صلاة الليل مثلها. That it is required for the one who has deemed Maghrib to be the witr of the daytime, or the end of the daytime, as Ibn Umar said, it is required for such a person who accepts this to deem the witr of the night prayer as similar to it. And it is similar to it. It should be similar. What does that mean? It means لا يفصل بينهما بالتسليم, right? That you do not distinguish between them in terms of you do not separate the witr prayer with a salam, because the view of some of the ulama, like the Malikis, is you pray 2 rak'ahs, you give a salam, then you rise up and you pray 1 rak'ah. The Hanafi say no, you just give a salam at the very end. You pray all 3 like the Maghrib and you give salam at the end. And so over here Imam Muhammad is saying that, well, if you guys are making this comparison between Salatul Maghrib being the witr of Salatul Nahar, if this is how you're describing it, then the witr of the prayers at night, the final prayer that sort of concludes all your night prayers, should be similar to the Maghrib prayer. And the Maghrib prayer is what? The Maghrib prayer is 3 cycles, and there's no salam in between the actual rak'ahs. And so this is why the Hanafis also gave preference to this idea of three cycles, of witr being 3 cycles. And then finally we have the issue of 1 salam. So over here basically Imam Quduri had, like we said, we had 3 issues when it came to the mode or the method of performing witr. One was that it be performed with 3 cycles, and that the other was that it be performed with a single salam. And so with 1 salam, again, there are explicit hadith regarding this in the prophetic traditions. One of the hadith that we took earlier from the Sunan of Nasa'i, if you look at it over here carefully, I didn't highlight this part over here because I didn't want to distract people while we were thinking about 3 cycles. But this hadith from the Sunan of Nasa'i, when the companion describes what the Prophet ﷺ was reciting in his witr prayer, what does he mention? وَلَا يُسَلِّمُ إِلَّا فِي آخِرِهِنَّ. And he will not give the salam except at the very end of the prayer. And so this is one of the hadith proofs that the Hanafis used. And then another related by Imam Muhammad himself in his Muwatta again, that the Aisha radiallahu anha, she said that the Prophet ﷺ كَانَ لَا يُسَلِّمُ فِي رَكْعَتَيْ الْوِتْرِ, that the Prophet would not give salam after 2 cycles of witr. He would not give the salam after 2 cycles of witr. So he would not pray witr as 2 cycles with a salam and then rise up for a final cycle and then complete that cycle. And this is also related by Imam al-Nasa'i. So that was a hadith proof. And then 2 further arguments the Hanafis make when it comes to the single salam issue is that when Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha, when she describes the night prayer of the Prophet, which we took from the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari, She simply describes the final prayer of the Prophet as he prayed three cycles. He prayed 3 rak'ah. And so the basis is that the way you would understand this, how would you understand this? You would understand it as any normal 3-cycled prayer. No, there's no. She does not provide any detail that he gave a salam after 2 cycles and then rose up for the final cycle and completed it. There's no such detail given. And so the basic assumption is that is the Maghrib prayer, namely that the whole prayer is performed and only at the end do you give the salam. And then, of course, the statement that witr is like Maghrib, again, we took this. This was also used as a proof that salam is only given at the end of all 3 cycles. You perform all 3 cycles, then only at the end do you give salam. So that is the Hanafi reasoning for the single salam as well. And then Imam al-Quduri, so we finished basically, this was the basic modality of the witr prayer, right? That it is 3 cycles and the salam is and the salam is given at the end of the 3 cycles, right? And we took the hadith proofs, and if you look at it from the lens of Hanafi epistemology, again, what you find is there are a series of textual and rational arguments in it. One of the arguments that the Hanafis make about a 1-cycled prayer is there's no such thing. It lacks precedent. Right? There's no precedent for a 1-cycled sunnah prayer. Right? Well, not just a sunnah prayer. There's no precedent for a 1-cycled prayer. Period. And so the Hanafis like to step back and they like to look at things as a whole, and they like to see, well, how does this particular rule fit into this broader system of law? And so when they see things like, well, the witr prayer is 1 cycle, they sort of scratch their heads a little bit because they're thinking to themselves, well, we haven't really seen, how is it 1 cycle? We haven't really seen a 1-cycle prayer before. It doesn't exist in our tradition. And so that's why they give preference to a 3-cycled prayer, because they're like, this has, there's a parallel in our tradition, in our fiqh, in our practice, to this idea of a 3-cycled prayer, which is the Maghrib prayer. And so Hanafis over here, if you read deeply, they give a variety of textual arguments from consistency, from logic, trying to situate these rulings and these nusus within the broader framework of the law and what they see as the ahkam and the practice of the Prophet ﷺ, and then doing tarjih of the riwayat and choosing what they prefer based on this view to this broader structure. And so that's something to keep in mind as well, always when looking at these legal rulings. So in the legal rulings that we just took, what do you see? You'll see a theory of the community. There's fuqaha like Umar ibn Khattab and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud that are giving this opinion. There's, of course, explicit hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. There are logical arguments in terms of what we just mentioned about a lack of precedent for a 1-cycled prayer, a precedent in the Maghrib, a comparison made between the witr of the day, and so on and so forth. And so these are various arguments that the Hanafis mentioned. And of course, the logical arguments extend even more when it comes to the debate on witr being wajib and sunnah, which is, okay, what are the peculiar qualities of the fard prayer found in the witr prayer? What are the peculiar qualities of the sunnah prayer found in the witr prayer? And what does this tell us about the nature of witr prayer itself? And this is all in addition to the nusus themselves. And so these are something that we need to pay careful attention to, because these legal meanings actually pop up everywhere across the entire spectrum of fiqhi ahkam. And so we've taken principles in like the bab of adhan that are popping up in congregational prayer, in recitation, and so on and so forth. And so these are things to keep in mind. So continuing with what Imam Quduri says, that he performs the qunut في الثالثة قبل ركوعه في جميع السنة, that he performs the qunut in the 3rd cycle before bowing throughout the year. And so again over here we have the qunut We can again take what is the ruling of the qunut and what is the description of the qunut. How was it performed? Let me check what time it is. So the ruling of the qunut is, according to Abu Hanifa, the qunut is wajib, and according to Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, it is a sunnah. Right? According to Abu Hanifa, it is wajib, and according to Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, it is a sunnah. One of the reasons why Abu Hanifa said that it is wajib is because the qunut was specifically revealed for the witr prayer, right? And it becomes akin to one of the khasa'is, or one of the very specific qualities of the qunut prayer, and akin to the tashahhud. It is almost akin to the tashahhud. So we've taken this ruling before. And again, according to Abu Yusuf Muhammad, I think I should have detailed this a little bit more. I do think that there is a qawl from them that it is considered wajib as well. So I'll have to double check that. I don't recall why I didn't mention that in the slide right now. But in the previous lesson that we took, remember when we spoke about the tashahhud, we took that there was a dispute on whether the tashahhud was considered a sunnah in the first sitting or it was considered a wajib. And then we read the Kitab al-Asl of Imam Muhammad, where he says that qunut, the tashahhud and the qunut are akin to one another, right? Insofar as not performing them requires the forgetfulness prostration. And so that would indicate that Imam Muhammad deems the qunut to be wajib as well. And so this may simply be, what I'm mentioning over here, may simply be one view ascribed to them. And so it requires some detailing. And inshallah, I can get back to everyone on the details of that, maybe at the beginning of the next lesson. But for now, we know that the mu'tamad, the relied upon view in the Hanafi school, is that qunut in the witr is considered wajib. Then we have performing the qunut before bowing and throughout the year. Over here again, we have various hadith from the companions. Over here specifically Ibn Mas'ud. There are two reports from him, one from the Kitab al-Athar of Imam Muhammad, where Ibn Mas'ud is described as, where Ibrahim al-Nakha'i describes Ibn Mas'ud as performing the qunut in witr qabla ruku'i fi sanati kulliha. He would perform it before bowing throughout the entire year. One of the things to note about Kitab al-Athar is this chain: Muhammad from Abu Hanifa, from Hammad, from Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, that Ibn Mas'ud said X, Y, and Z. Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, as far as I know, did not meet. He was a student of the students of Ibn Mas'ud. So Ibrahim al-Nakha'i was a student of Alqama ibn Qais, who was one of the most prominent and famous students of Ibn Mas'ud. And Ibrahim took from many other students of Ibn Mas'ud as well. And he was considered one of the great fuqaha of Kufa. And Hammad was his main student. And Hammad was the main student of Ibrahim, and of course Abu Hanifa was the main student of Hammad. And so this chain really is a very trustworthy chain. Ibrahim was very intimately aware of the practice of Ibn Mas'ud. And the reason for this was that he spent so much time in the company of the students of Ibn Mas'ud. And so oftentimes, some of the ulama mention that when Ibrahim says the practice of Ibn Mas'ud was this is actually stronger than when he actually mentions his direct chain to Ibn Mas'ud. Right? And the reason for this is because when Ibrahim simply mentions that Ibn Mas'ud did this is something that he's received from a very large group of the students of Ibn Mas'ud. It's almost as if he's conveying that this was the well-known practice of Ibn Mas'ud. And so over here, Ibn Mas'ud, his practice is relayed by Ibrahim as what? As doing the qunut before bowing and doing it throughout the year. Because there are some ulama who said no, qunut in witr is specified to the last half of Ramadan. Right? Some ulama say it is mansukh. there are various aqwal. The Hanafi say that no, it is legislated and it is done throughout the year and it is done before one goes into bowing, right? And then Imam al-Tirmidhi over here mentions, after he mentions specific hadith regarding the qunut, he says, وَاخْتَلَفَ أَهْلُ الْعِلْمِ فِي الْقُنُوتِ فِي الْوِتْرِ فرأى عبد الله بن مسعود القنوت في الوتر في السنة كلها واختار القنوت قبل الركوع وهو قول بعض أهل العلم وبه يقول سفيان الثوري وابن المبارك وإسحاق وأهل الكوفة. And so Ibn Masud at-Tirmidhi, what does he mention? That the Ahl al-Ilm differed on the qunut in the witr. Abdullah bin Mas'ud viewed the performance of qunut in witr as being throughout the year, and he chose the view that it be performed before bowing. And this is the position of some of the Ahl al-Ilm, and this is the view that Sufyan al-Thawri and Ibn Mubarak and Ishaq ibn Rahaway and the people of Kufa chose. And so there's a lot of precedent. Again, this returns to this idea, point number 3 in our epistemological lens, point number 2, which is a theory of the early legal community, where Hanafis gave preference to the fuqaha of this early legal community. And to them, Ibn Mas'ud was at the top tier of some of these fuqaha. And Ibrahim was amongst the top tier of the fuqaha of the tabi'in. And so their views were not always, but on many instances, especially when they accorded with the text, were seen as very weighty in what they conveyed. And so this was some of the proofs that the Hanafis used for this aspect of witr. And then Imam al-Quduri says, وَيَقْرَأُ فِي كُلِّ رَكْعَةٍ مِنَ الْوِتْرِ فَاتِحَةَ الْكِتَابِ وَسُورَةٌ مَعَهَا. One recites the Fatiha with a surah in every cycle of the witr prayer. And again, this is wajib based on ihtiyat. This is wajib based on ihtiyat or precaution. And again, we took that this was one of the arguments that was furnished by Abu Yusuf al-Muhammad when it came to justifying that witr is a sunnah. They said, well, you have to perform the qira'ah in every cycle, right? You have to perform a required recitation in every cycle of the witr prayer. And this is something unique to the sunan and the nawafil. In the fard prayer, you only have to do it for the first 2 rak'ahs. The last 2 rak'ahs, or the last rak'ah of a 3-cycle prayer, you have a choice of whether you want to recite or not. It is not an obligation in those 2 cycles, in the final cycle of a 3-cycled obligatory prayer, or the final 2 cycles of a 4-cycled obligatory prayer, to recite anything in those cycles. And so Abu Hanifa, his argument was basically that, listen, the witr from some perspectives resembles the fard, right? From other perspectives, however, there's an ihtimal, there's a possibility that it might be a nafil prayer, it might be a sunnah prayer, right? Because the reason why we have not labeled it to be fard, the reason why we have labeled or ruled the witr to be a wajib, is because there's a shubha, there's a doubt in the dalil regarding its obligatory nature. And this is why we have relegated it from the rank of being obligatory to the status of being as decisive as the proof for the normal fard prayer. And so here, Abu Hanifa, what he says is that because and its evidence in terms of being obligatory, what I will do is I will say recite in all 3 cycles of the witr prayer as a matter of wujub, out of precaution. And the precaution is over here is because it just may well be, we return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he said it was only a question legislates the wujub of qira'ah, or the obligation of qira'ah, in all 3 cycles of the witr prayer. And so this returns to the point that we mentioned earlier, that Abu Hanifa's response to Abu Yusuf al-Muhammad on this point is that, well, we're not legislating qira'ah witr uh, uh, in all of an abundance of precaution, that there's an ihtimal, there's a possibility of it being a sunnah, even though the evidence suggests that it is closer to the fard, and thus we give it the ruling of being wajib. And then Imam Quduri says, when he intends to perform the qunut, what does he do? كبر ورفع يديه ثم قنته. That when he intends to perform the qunut, this is how the Prophet ﷺ is described to have done it. We've already taken that takbir is whenever you're doing intiqal from one position to another, from one action to another, the takbir is legislated for that. This is the only other instance in which you do raf'ul yadayn in the Hanafi school, and of course the qunut is done before the bound, as we took basically the section on witr prayer. Now we'll end with this section on the minimal recitation. There are a number of ahkam in this section that we've already taken, so we'll try to go through them quickly. Over here, so Imam al-Quduri begins by saying, وَلَيْسَ فِي شَيْءٍ مِنَ الصَّلَوَاتِ قِرَاءَةُ سُورَةٍ بِعَيْنِهَا لَا يُجْزِي فِيهَا غَيْرُهَا. There is no specific recitation incumbent in prayer such that reciting something else would not suffice. So this is fairly straightforward. You're not. What does that mean? This simply means the point that we took earlier. You don't have to recite. It is not required, for example, for you to recite the Fatiha. It is not required for you to recite a specific surah. The Quran says, what does the Quran say? فَقْرَأُوا مَا تَيَسَّرَ مِنْهُ. We mentioned how this specific verse it obligates a minimal recitation, and it gives individuals a choice in what they recite of the Quran. And so there's no specific recitation in terms of the Fatiha, in terms of a specific surah, that is required in any prayer without which thing that fulfills the minimal recitation, and your prayer will be considered valid. And there's no specific instruction from the Prophet ﷺ to, that for Asr prayer you have to recite Qul Huwallahu Ahad, or for Maghrib prayer you have to recite this. All these specifications that come from the Prophet are by way of istihbab or recommendation, and not by way of this ruling means. Then he says that it is disliked ويكره أن يتخذ سورة لصلاة بعينها لا يقرأ غيرها. It is disliked to specify a particular surah for a prayer and not recite anything except it. Now, this dislikedness over here is basically, it only relates to when you take a specific surah, right, and you consider a specific prayer to be incumbent, or to be the most optimal way of praying, or to be of specific merit, when that has not been proven. When that has not been proven. So if you say, I'm going to recite Qul Huwallahu Ahad in X prayer all the time, and you believe that, why? Because it's the best thing to do, or it's wajib upon you, anything to indicate the incumbency of this, or perhaps to indicate the afdaliyah or the preferable nature of this act. Yes, if there's a specific text, like the Prophet ﷺ, he would recite in the first rak'ah of witr that we just took, Sabbih isma rabbikal a'la, then it is fine. And even then, recite other things as well, because inevitably, the Prophet was not reciting that in every single witr prayer in his life. I mean, he recited other things as well, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this dislikedness is also lifted if one recites something out of a force of habit, or because he does not know much of the Quran. So new Muslims For example, a new Muslim simply, he only knows Qul Huwallahu Ahad. He has an excuse. Then Imam al-Quduri mentions the minimal recitation, and this is something that we've taken in quite some depth in earlier lessons, that what is the adna ما يجزي من القراءة في الصلاة. The adna is ما يتناوله. This idea of ما يتناوله اسم at the end of the previous lesson as well, and how it and the various differences that arise in terms of how it is understood and applied by the various ulama. وقال Abu Yusuf Muhammad, that what did Abu Yusuf Muhammad say? That the minimal for a valid prayer is من ثلاث آيات قصار أو آية طويلة. This is something that we've detailed when it came to the arkan of salah, and so anyone who wants to know the details regarding that can go back to that lesson. And then we have this important issue of ولا يقرأ المؤتم خلف الإمام. The follower does not recite behind the imam. And I think this is the last issue that we'll take. Over here, again, these are decided on this. You can pick up something like Fiqh al-Imam of Mufti Abdurrahman Yusuf Mangera and read the section on this, and you'll get all the hadith proofs and so on and so forth. I'll just mention some simple proofs. The basic proof, again, the Hanafis like to start from the Quran. And so the Quran says, وَإِذَا قُرِيَ الْقُرْآنِ فَاسْتَمِعُوا لَهُ وَانصِتُوا, and listen to it and be silent in order that God may have mercy upon you. And so over here, again, this Quranic verse, according to the Hanafis, is considered, it is clear, it is decisive in its establishment. It is related in a number of tafsir that this verse was specifically Salah. Ibn Mas'ud, for example, mentions that during the Salah, the Sahaba, before the revelation of this verse, people would give salams to them and they would respond while in Salah and stuff. And so this verse was revealed that إِذَا قُرِيَ الْقُرْآنُ فَاسْتَمِعُوا لَهُ, that when the Quran is recited, they listen to it and remain silent. And so after that, the companions stayed silent in their prayers. And so over here, there are two commands, and one is a command to stay quiet, right? And so when the recitation is out loud, then you have to listen to it, right? Because you can hear it. But when the recitation is not out loud, then the imam is still reciting, and so there's a mission upon you to stay quiet, right? And these are both commands, and so commands entail obligation. This verse was revealed for the prayer, and one of the questions that, of course, arises over here is you do have a seeming conflict in the nusus, because on the one hand, what does the Quran say? فَقْرَعُوا مَا تَيَسَّرَ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ. Recite that which is easy for you from the Quran. And so there's a minimal recitation. And so in order to condition that, you need, according to Hanafi usul, you need a text of almost equal status to condition that verse. And so this verse is sufficient for that, because it is also the Quran, it is also a command, it is also decisive in its transmission and in the meaning that it indicates. And so the Hanafi said that, yeah, prayer need to perform, but then this verse comes and it specifies it to being in a context where you're not behind an imam in a congregational setting where the Quran is being recited by the imam, right? So this verse can condition that verse. And so it applies to both the loud prayer and the silent prayer.